I'm going to be a bit boring because I'm going to talk about history. And someone warned me that I'll have to do my best to keep you all awake. I don't have any confessions to make as the previous speaker. But can I say that firstly that as with all the speeches, they will eventually become available. I have a PowerPoint presentation and I also have a written speech that will be available from Megan and afterwards. The second one is, I think Dave's point about history and who controls history is very important, because we at the Foundation find more and more that the narrative around 1990 is being changed. The narrative is basically that F.W. de Klerk had no option, he just had to hand over. It was sort of it was a no-brainer. You know, there was pressure, and he sat shivering in the Union buildings and said, please come and take over. That is obviously not the case, and I hope that what I'm going to share with you will show that that was not the case. And secondly, there's an old proverb that the only thing we learn from history is that we don't learn from history. And I hope that what I share with you today, although it's happened just less than 30 years ago, would be a lesson at least for the future. Because we are, I think, again at the brink of a point where the present government is losing legitimacy and cannot itself facilitate or start processes that are necessary. And therefore, civil society, many of organizations whom here this morning may have to take the lead. Megan, can I have that? Can we have the PowerPoint presentation on, please? While we're waiting, let me say the outline of presentation is basically to look at the background, the 2nd of February, very briefly, and then we're going to look at the peace process that led to the signing of the peace accord. You'll see out there on the presentation. Then the CODESA process. And many people today still don't know that there were two distinct processes. The one was CODESA, the one that failed, and the other one was the multi-party negotiating process, the MPNP. And looking at that, that would be the main thrust of the presentation, and then some lessons learned and a last warning slide as it is. On the background, not too much, just to get you on the same page. Many people say that they think that the cracks of apartheid started with the Soweto uprising in '76. We had the tricameral parliament that cemented, in a sense, the exclusion of black people from the politics of South Africa. We had in the 80s the securocrat state of P.W. Botha and the states of emergencies. The Namibian issue was resolved. The ambassador spoke widely about, long about the fall of the Berlin Wall. And then I think, taking from Mr. de Klerk's own book, the realization that apartheid in whichever form is not practically sustainable nor morally justified. And then, almost an act of God, if you're a religious person, the illness and removal of P.W. Botha, because he was bound to carry on for some time, as we know of a previous president recently. And then F.W. de Klerk became president in September 1989. And people often forget that within 4 months of becoming president, 4 months, he took the decision that changed the country. Now, that is a world record in anyone's game. And I think that often when people tell me he didn't do enough or whatever, I said, think of that. And then secret bilateral started between between the government and the ANC even before, but then obviously after the 2nd of February that continued. Much will be said later about 2nd of February, so I'm not going to dwell too much upon it. Let me just say that it was a complete surprise to 99.99% of the population. I myself was in London in talks with ANC members, amongst them Aziz Pahar, and Aziz was gobstruck. He couldn't believe it. And therefore, again, when the ANC says FW just had to hand over, it's not true. Because because otherwise Aziz wouldn't have been surprised. The announcement showed commitment to a negotiated solution. It didn't show the way, it didn't say this is what we'll do. And as you know, the ANC and the other parties were unbanned, Mandela and other leaders released. This normalized the situation somewhat, and the bilateral started, the Groene Skierminute, the DF Malanminute. But violence plagued the country, especially between supporters of the ANC and the Zulu-based IFP, and probably history showed fueled by rogue elements in the security forces. And around that time, about 4,000 people died, talking about blood in the streets, and something needed to be done. Now, the peace process does not get high ratings in any history books of South Africa. I think there's only one book written about the peace process. And I think the simple fact is that when journalists or authors interview politicians, they don't talk about things they were not in control of. And this is one of the areas where business, the labor unions, and the churches played a colleague role, a supporting role to the peace process. So in early 1991, the churches, Reformed churches, came together in Rustenburg, and they had the Rustenburg Declaration asking for a peaceful resolution of the country and the end of violence. Mr. de Klerk then called the National Peace Conference, but because he didn't, in their view, consult properly with the ANC, they refused to participate. And it seemed to us, and I was at the time at the organization called Consultative Business Movement, CBM, that all the good of the DF Malanminute and the Groene Skierminute could go down the drain because there was a public enmity between the parties. And so those leaders stepped in and first asked Mr. de Klerk to not have the conference, asked Mr. Mandela to attend the conference. They couldn't, they had already committed in public, and it was the typical South African compromise. It was agreed that the government could go ahead with the conference with most of the parties. The ANC wouldn't attend, but they also wouldn't condemn the conference in public, as long as no firm decisions were taken, and they would then join the peace process later on. And at that conference, Dr. Low Alberts was mutually agreed as the chair of a 13-person committee, and a multi-party sectoral committee took place in June 1991 at Barlow Park, the headquarters of Barlow World. At the time, the two co-chairs were Desmond Tutu and John Hall, and after a difficult start, the process was agreed. It's interesting, I was there as a junior facilitator, and we in CBM had realized the importance of process. Now today, processes, everyone does it, but how to get people involved, how not to alienate them, etc., etc. And after the first session, the parties were really grandstanding, and they made positional statements that made it very difficult for them to compromise on anything. And during the break, which Bishop Tutu called, I sat down and on a piece of paper, just put down a process from where we were to where peace accord could be signed. And it was simple, but it gave a way forward. And when I gave it to Bishop Tutu, I said, try this. And he said to me, no, you try it, young man. And I then spoke to it, and within about 15 minutes, the parties agreed the principle of that process, which was to work with some technical committees, multi-party working groups, on a code of conduct for political parties, code of conduct for security forces, socio-economic development, implementation and monitoring of the agreements, and the process secretariat and media. And that led to the National Peace Convention held in September 1991. Sorry about that. Peace accord signed by all political parties. I think in the end, one or two right-wing groups didn't sign it, and ZAPU and the PAC, although they said they agreed with the spirit of it, they couldn't get themselves to agree with it. And what then happened is that there was a National Peace Committee, which was sort of the political arm, and a National Peace Secretariat funded by the government. And the National Peace Secretariat basically had conflict resolution on a national scale, localized through regional and local peace committees. And by April '94, at the time of the election, there was one national, 11 regional, and 250 local peace committees, containing all the actors in every community. And not only did they work for peace in those communities, but also starting to look at conflict resolution and also socio-economic development. And that helped to contain violence and create conditions for the parties to forge the constitutional and democratic order. And I often wonder what would have happened if the government, the present government, had maintained those peace committees at a fraction of the cost that they're now pumping into municipalities. Today, those committees could have been a very important factor at local level to help municipalities that are in trouble. Anyway, that was the peace process. The signing of the peace accord did not lead to negotiations immediately. The ANC and the government still had some issues to resolve. And so CODESA, abbreviation for Convention for a Democratic South Africa, started in December 1991. The trust was low, the tension high, and there was this famous altercation between Mr. Klerk and Mr. Mandela. Mr. Klerk can correct me in his speech if I'm wrong, but my information is that he wanted to, under pressure from, call it the right wing of the National Party, had to address some concerns about some of the ANC's plans through Operation Vula and the armed forces to raise that in that public forum. He sent a message to Mr. Mandela that he's going to raise it, be aware of it. The ANC's apparatus apparently wasn't that good, and the message never reached Mr. Mandela. So out of the blue, Mr. de Klerk raised this, and Mr. Mandela obviously reacted very irritably. And I remember I sat next to one of the government people on my hunches, and I listened to Mr. Mandela. I said, "We're in trouble," and he said, "We're in deep trouble." But obviously we overcame that, and it went ahead. So in January 1992, we started very enthusiastically with negotiations. Now this was the first time in South Africa that I think anyone negotiated on this scale. And quite a number of mistakes were made, structurally and politically. I think the parties obviously started only feeling each other out. But think of this, if we did this today, we had 5 working groups. They consisted of 80 politicians each. They didn't meet in back rooms, they met in public with the media there. So what happened? On a Monday, we were starting, we had a certain topic on the agenda. So the media called on a Saturday and said, Mr. Meyer, well, it wasn't Roof at the time, I think it was Karafiloon, what will your position be on this? So duly, the party said, this will be our position. The ANC, the National Party says, what's your position? So on Sunday, the negotiations were over before they began, because the parties were already in entrenched positions and they couldn't have any compromises. So from the outside, I realized that was not going to help us. And obviously that was a start. We gallantly tried. At the time, in the first CODESA process, I was head of the secretariat, so we looked after the minutes and the agendas and stuff like that. The other problem of the CODESA process was that there were 5 these mammoth working groups. They had to report into a thing called the management committee. Most of the parties were there, but because of the trust in the parties amongst each other was so low, there were some tensions between the management committee and all the working groups. So there wasn't a central negotiating body to really take this forward. Now, it's easy to criticize it now, looking back, but that's the fact. So there were also no technical input. We asked the politicians, don't you need some academics? They said, no, we can do it ourselves. They didn't trust the academics. So no technical input. Perhaps the parties themselves got the input at home, but in the working groups, they were just politicians. And so in May 1992, CODESA ended in deadlock, not only for these structural reasons, there were also political reasons. I think trust between the parties, there were some political issues to which I'll come back later, just made it impossible. And the ANC then took to the streets. They reacted to the Boipatong massacre, which was proven later to have been committed by the IFP, and also then the very unfortunate killing of people in Ciskei, when the ANC marched on Ciskei and the soldiers opened fire on the crowd. Why did CODESA fail? Now there are some members who were there. Suzanne Vos was there, I think Renier was there, Renier Kuchelberg, Sheila Cameron was there. We will. I'm coming back to the women. I've not spoken about men either, Sheila. The political reasons was the nature of the transition. The ANC said we cannot negotiate because we're unelected. We don't have legitimacy. The National Party said no, we are an elected government, we must first negotiate and then we'll have an election. So that was a problem. The percentage needed to change the constitution, the ANC said 51%. The National Party, I think, started at 75%. The form of state, federal unitary, in which Chief Buthelezi played a major role. He wanted a totally federal state, especially for the Zulus. Protection of minority rights, should it be group rights or not? And not enough cohesion and trust. Some parties thought they could still go it alone. And basically, the two main parties were, at that stage, the National Party government, which was actually two delegations, and the ANC, and the DP, the Democratic Party, played a very important intellectual role, and the IFP was also there. Most of the homeland parties at the time wasn't sure whether they would join the alliance with the government or whether they would join the alliance of the ANC. Later on, it became very clear that most of them joined the alliance with the ANC. Now, the process and structural reasons, it was the structure and size of the working group, public negotiating, grandstanding, no central and small enough negotiating forum. You can't negotiate in public with 80 people. That became very clear. Lack of non-partisan and technical expertise, no initially agreed compromise seeking and deadlock breaking mechanisms. Those are things that should be done before. Overall administration was party politically controlled. There were three, one National Party government, one ANC, and one IFP person in the administration. And Murphy Marobe, an ex-UDF member, was head of the administration. Many of the smaller parties felt that that was partisan. And so on the content, there was still a feeling of each other out, and the options were explored. So after June 1992, there was only one channel open. They called it the channel between Rolf Meyer and Cyril Ramaphosa. And they asked me then to become the head of the administration of the whole process, as well as having the secretariat under us. Now, I was always surprised that we were asked, CBM, the organization I belong to, on the early morning of the night before we had agreed on the interim constitution. Rolf and Cyril and I were looking at the people partying, and I said to them, we've come a long way. And one of them, I can't remember which, said, yes, but we didn't trust you. We thought you were national intelligence. And was Cyril. And Rolf said, no, but we thought you were ANC. I said, well, I'm glad I was in that position. In September 1992, the channel started working, and there was a record of understanding between the ANC and the government. It was cemented by two Bosparade at the end of 1992 and the beginning of 1993, and the two main parties were again ready to come to the table. And in March 1993, the multi-party negotiations process started. There was a bit of an issue. For about a week, we fought about the name. Some wanted to call it CODESA 2, some said, no, it can't be CODESA, that failed. Eventually, we came up with a brilliant name, the multi-party negotiations process. But what's in the name? Major differences with CODESA in terms of process and structures, quite a number, I'll show you. Technical working groups, there were a number of technical working groups, and they had experts appointed by the parties, trusted by the parties, but talking about legal issues or about economic issues. It wasn't just the politicians. There was a planning committee, not a management committee, a planning committee that was sort of a facilitating committee, also about 7 or so of the parties represented on that. And then there was a negotiating council. Now here I come, Sheila, to the women. 2 plus 2, at least 2 women in each delegation. So there were 4 per party. That made about 38 plus 38. It was still big, but it was at least 38 people in a room. But what happened here, what changed from the first, is that the technical committees would bring reports from the parties who were represented on those technical committees to the planning committee. Let me just show you the process here. You had administration and secretariat, then you had technical committees, 6 members or so. They started doing work under the guidance of the parties. They then brought it to the planning committee first, and the planning committee looked at it, and on that planning committee sat, for instance, Colin Eglin, Rolf Meyer, Joe Slovo, Cyril Ramaphosa, Robin Gordon. And they would then say, look, this is something we think we could reach consensus, it can go to the negotiating council. The negotiating forum only sat once, and we realized that this would be a duplication. And the plenary sat only once when we agreed the interim constitution on the day, on the evening of the 17th of November 1993. We which incidentally was Cyril's birthday and also my late father's birthday. That's why I remember it. So this process flowed. And now sometimes the negotiating council may not be happy, and they would refer it back to the planning committee, to the subcommittee. What's not shown here is an informal committee consisting of only 2 people. Fanny van der Merwe, at the time the Director General of Constitutional Development, and Mac Maharaj. And they were called the subcommittee. So if anything went wrong, either in the technical committees or wherever, we would send in the subcommittee. They were sort of facilitators. They had no status, formal status, but they played a very important role to oil the wheels. So the Maharaj and van der Merwe, there was an objective neutral administration. CBM had 2 people, myself and a secretary. And then the rest of the administration were made up of people the parties seconded to the process. So the parties felt that they were part of the process. If anyone wanted to jinx the minutes, they would be there to check that it didn't happen. So that worked better. And within 9 months, an interim constitution was accepted. Now that is also, I think, a world record. And that interim constitution didn't change much. I'll come to some of the content just now. And obviously that led to the first democratic election in 1994. The technical committees were tasked with the following issues. The constitutional issues. That would be the form of state, the powers of the regions. Violence was still an issue. Fundamental human rights. The TEC, the Transitional Executive Council. The Independent Electoral Commission, which is still in existence today. And the Independent Media Commission. And discriminatory legislation. Interesting of the South African process, and the German ambassador referred to that, there was never external mediation, influence, facilitation. I think we were too stubborn, and we didn't trust anyone to come and tell us how to solve our own problems, which is a good thing and a bad thing. So the one attempt around international mediation, which Chief Buthelezi drove after the election date had already been agreed, he wanted international mediation to, in a sense, postpone the election date. And not many people know this, but Henry Kissinger and his team of mediators arrived, I think, 8 o'clock on what was then still Jan Smuts Airport. And immediately they met with Cyril and Roof, and they left on the 4 o'clock plane that afternoon. And Cyril and Roof were both furious, also with me. They thought I had anything to do with it. I didn't have anything to do with it, but my colleague back at CBM was approached by Chief Minister Buthelezi and, of all people, Mr. Zuma, who had an issue with the Zulus. He wanted that to be solved. But that happened, we didn't have any outside intervention, very complex, multi-layered, drawn-out process. The majority of the parties didn't want to, and no external party was trusted enough. I do say that I think some parties did have an indirect influence. I think there was continuous discussions with the government and also with the ANC by ambassadors, emissaries from other bodies to be up to date with the process, but there was never any mediation from outside. What were the major obstacles and processes? There were 2 main issues, 3 perhaps. The one is I mentioned that the National Party government wanted to renegotiate the final constitution before elections, while the ANC, well, actually not renegotiate, to negotiate the final constitution before elections, while the ANC said, no, we must hold elections first, and then the elected Constituent Assembly will do it. And obviously that might have put the government National Party at a disadvantage, so they stuck to their guns. The compromise was one of the lesser known but very imaginative solutions that we had. We agreed on what is called a 3-phase transition. There would be, by the parties at the multi-party negotiating process, an interim constitution negotiated and agreed by Parliament, so that elections could take place in terms of that constitution, and then the final constitution will be written by the elected Constituent Assembly. Basically, the House of Provincial Leaders, provincial provinces, House of Provinces, and the National Assembly. But to ensure that the majority couldn't just run away with this final constitution, there was an agreement that there would be 34. The number wasn't agreed. We built up, that there were some principles, eventually they came to 34 principles agreed in the interim constitution that had to be also in the final constitution, to the extent that the Constitutional Court had to certify that as such. And the Constitutional Court took twice sent back the final constitution because some of those 34 principles were not adhered to. It's interesting that quite a number of those 34 principles are today in contention by the ANC, which is a good sign also that the ANC didn't run roughshod over anyone, otherwise they wouldn't have wanted to change the constitution today. So that was the first one. The second one is the whole question of state, the form of state, federal or unitary, and I think the National Party's view about that changed, also the ANC. And in the time where there was a deadlock between Codeso One and multi-party negotiating process, CBM, the organization I was with the permission of the major parties, facilitated the process to engage with international, constitutional, and local experts to suss out what possibilities are there about regions, powers of regions. And eventually, it was around the question of decentralized provinces, but in a unitary state with asymmetrical powers. And that basically was put into both constitutions almost without any change. So that took away the big spectre of federal or unitary. I think the only party that was unhappy with that was the IFP at the time, and they had to accept that. And then the final big issue was group rights or individual rights. The ANC obviously wanted only individual rights and only just, and the National Party initially started with group rights. The compromise was that individual rights will be given in the Bill of Rights, but that individuals could form communities and could exercise their rights, especially with language, religion, and culture. And there were some clauses in the Constitution that are still there today. And I think that's the other one that's also today under pressure from the ANC and other parties. Then 3 obstacles. The assassination of Chris Hani in April 1993 was a major setback. We had just started. We broke for the Easter weekend, and during the Easter weekend, that happened. And I remember I was in Plettenberg Bay having a break in John Hall's house, and I went to the shop to buy a paper, and the owner of the shop said, "Did you hear Chris Hani was killed? Good riddance." And I said to him, "You don't know what you're talking about. This could be catastrophe." Fortunately, all the parties had restraint. Mandela showed a lot of restraint. Even Mr. Klerk and others went to the township, where the region, the East Rand, where it happened. And I think that was put beside. Mr. Mandela especially said to his angry supporters that even though he may have been killed by a white man, and not a South African, the murder was reported by an Afrikaans white woman. And that was a typical symbolic thing that Mandela would do to ease the tension. But that was a crisis. We went over, and then in June 1992, when the National Party and the ANC pushed through, in a certain sense, the election date as the 27th of April, the IFP, that was the Concerned South African Group, including the IFP, the biggest party, that would have been the Botswana government, the Sky government, and so on, Transkei government, walked out weeks before the election. And I remember in the planning committee when they decided to do this, I spoke out of turn, as the administration head, I didn't really have a say, and I said to Cyril, "But you can't do this will flop the process." And he said, "We just did." And obviously what I realized then is that the National Party government and the ANC had, even though they were political enemies, they had a process alliance. They wanted to have an election as soon as possible. That's why they pushed very hard. Then perhaps the story that's well known very quickly, the IFP was out, the election ballot papers were already printed, and then Washington Akumu, who stayed behind as one of the international mediators, phoned Mr. Buthelezi and said, "My brother, I want to see you." They were both Christians, they knew each other, and they had a date to meet, or an appointment to meet at Lanseria Airport. Ukumu was late. Mr. Buthelezi's plane took off, and if that was the case, the IFP wouldn't have been in election. But fortunately, Mr. Buthelezi's plane had engine trouble, So it turned around, and when they landed, there was Washington and Kumu, and they had a long talk, and Washington basically said to him, if you're going to not participate in this election, you can just as well now go to the northern hills of KwaZulu-Natal, you will be out. And that made him agree. CBM helped to get to Mr. de Klerk, to Mr. Mandela, said, can we allow the IFP in? And actually on the ballot paper, you'll remember, I think it was alphabetical, but that right at the bottom of the first page of the ballot paper, after the fact, the IFP's name was brought on. And that, I think, meant that we had a very peaceful election. If it hadn't been for that, the day of the election might not have been peaceful. And then finally, a major obstacle, the invasion of the armed AWB members. For those who don't know, that stands for the Afrikaner Weerstandsbeweging, or the Afrikaans Resistance Movement. They wanted to stop the negotiations, and they actually stormed the World Trade Center with guns. Fortunately not semi-automatic guns, with rail guns and pistols and things like that, and some of them were drunk. The politicians vacated the building. A number of them went into the National Party government's offices, because those offices were the only ones with concrete walls. The others were sort of this, a bullet can go right through it. Eventually that also passed, and the parties didn't let that deviate from the law. Why was the multi-party negotiation process successful? Quickly, smaller groups, I spoke about that, technical working committees. I think the politicians became more sensitive about the skill and process management. Detailed work done in technical committees, and so as I said, there was a flow of process. The technical committee did the work, went to the planning committee, went to negotiating council. If the negotiating council wasn't happy, they referred it back, and so there was an iterative process. Obviously, when we couldn't reach, or when they couldn't reach consensus, often the National Party and the ANC would say, leave it to us, we're having a Bosparade this weekend. And they would come back with a resolution on the Monday. The other interesting thing is that we had rotating chairs in the negotiating council. So there was a panel of 6 chairs, people who could be good chairs. Pravin Gordon was one of them, David de Villiers was one of them, Colin Eglin was one of them. And when X was the chair, Y was the deputy chair. So the next day, Y became the deputy chair, and Z became the chair, and Y and Z became the. So there was a rotation, and that made the parties feel that they wouldn't be negatively influenced by having an ANC chair when you're discussing something that the National Party was against. The negotiating council was indeed open to the media, and it was actually broadcast live on SABC television. One of the things I had to do was to protect the television cameras when the AWB stormed into the negotiating council, because they were literally 4 cameras were there permanently. But that was good because there was some transparency, but obviously much of the work was done outside the negotiating council. And then after major breakthroughs, there was first a joint, very important, a joint media session telling the media what the negotiating council had achieved with that. Afterwards, they were separate for each party, because it was deemed important that every party should also manage their constituents. So that the National Party and the ANC may say, we agree, the DP said, yes, we agree. Afterwards, the ANC could go and say, well, we had a victory today because we put some wool over their eyes, and the National Party could say the same. So that was a way to manage constituencies. Deadlocks, as I said, taken to a Bosparade, the process aligned. Impartial and objective administration is important. There were opportunities to build trust and relationships, and I really think that someone should do a PhD on the role of alcohol in the successful negotiations, because it's true. I mean, it's psychologically true, emotionally true, that when you've had a beer or two, you feel a little bit less tense, and you start seeing the other guy as not just another guy. So I think Mr. Klerk will agree that. Very quickly, if I have a minute or two, Dave, lessons learned. So rules of engagement. In this case, and although this is not public, my sense is that the ANC and the National Party government decided we will have beginning of 1994 an election. We need a constitution to do that. That's the broad objective. Often people today, when they say, well, there isn't enough economic stuff in the constitution, we still have that. Some some of us here even say we want an economic Odessa. They say, why didn't they do this? The point is, the country was burning, people were being killed. And we were trying to get to the election as quickly as possible. That was the broad objective that the two main parties shared. Venue and cost was important. Where's the venue? It shouldn't be a two-flush hotel. It was basically a store, a big store with a roof over it, and that worked well. Administration secretariat I spoke about, one small enough negotiating body, technical input, small coordinating committee. The name of the process, don't negotiate in public, but ensure a degree of transparency, flow of decisions, decision-making process. Here's an interesting one. The decision-making was done by so-called sufficient consensus. And I remember my colleague who wrote the minutes at one point asked Cyril, I must report in the minutes what you agreed on, what is sufficient consensus. Just tell me. Now, formally, sufficient consensus was described as enough parties agree with the decision to make the process go forward. You don't need a majority of 51, it's enough parties. Cyril said to my colleague, sufficient consensus is when Rolf and I agree. And it's funny, but it's also true, and it's probably important enough. And obviously some of the other parties didn't like that, but the two main actors agreed that this is our process, especially, and we won't let it sideline. And then finally, a small point that many politicians will not agree with, and that is that preparation and maturity of the negotiators. In 1991, I think looking back, we could say that very few of the politicians ever negotiated. Perhaps Cyril negotiated in labor issues when he was still in the trade unions. And there was a guy called Roger Fisher, who was the architect of the Egypt-Israeli 1967 agreement. And he came to South Africa with a team, and they met with all the major parties. They had workshops with the negotiators of the National Party, with the ANC, and I think also with the DP. They couldn't get meetings with the IFP and with the Freedom Front, the right-wing parties. And it was clear in the negotiations that the maturity of those parties lacked. And I think Roger Fisher is now deceased, must get some recognition for the work that he had done to help the negotiators understand how to negotiate for a good outcome. In negotiations, visibly committed, stay so, break down big issues like an elephant, eat it, keep our ultimate goal, use constructive ambiguity optimally. Sometimes it's important in negotiations that you don't spell out exactly what you mean. You must leave room for parties to interpret so that they can find themselves and agree. If you do it too minutely, too specifically, they'll never agree. And today, perhaps we have the same problem in legislation. But it's a way to get to consensus on smaller issues to get to the big topic. Self-imposed deadlines. As an administration, I often said to the parties, you cannot do this, we won't make it. You know, there was commissions about the flag, about the national anthem. We never made it. But what I realized afterwards, that a self-imposed deadline put pressure on the delegates, and it speeds up the process. Ensure reports, minutes, and agendas are trustworthy and on time. Social opportunities, iterative process. I conclude. This may be interesting or not. Point is, in 2001, I made this slide, and I didn't change it. I couldn't because I couldn't get into the background. But I thought I should share this with you. In 2001, we were still fresh. And I said we had, during apartheid, bad governance, lack of socioeconomic fruits for all, lack of human rights, crime, and lack of morality. That led to conflict and violence during the apartheid time. That led to the peace accord, obviously first the 2nd of February. That led to constitutional negotiations, the interim constitutional election, final constitution. And now we are here. We have a legitimate constitution. This is 2000. Now, this legitimate government must make sure that we don't get into that cycle again. And for some time, we had good governance. We had economic growth and socioeconomic development. We had human rights. We had safety and security. We had morality turned back. But this is now starting to go away. The question is, and I think that's what the ambassador also referred to this morning, we are now again here. And this cyclically will move there. And that's why I think this is not just an exercise in history. It's something that we should heed today. Because unless we stop this in today's South Africa, we will end up in this cycle, and it's not clear that we will arrive there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Theuns. I think what Theuns has pointed out is that peace doesn't happen by accident. It involves a great deal of very hard work, planning and thought, but the results are overwhelmingly positive. And now to bring us into the present from the past, we are going to call on Moeletsi and Mbeki to give us his perspective of South Africa now, 30 years after the 2nd of February. Once again, his very impressive CV is in the program.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, President de Klerk, Mrs. de Klerk, Ambassador, Chairman, Mr. Dave Stewart. I have prepared a paper which I was going to read on what is happening in the present. But after listening to the German ambassador, I've changed my strategy completely. I was very moved by what the ambassador said. In fact, one of the books that I read about Germany, and like most people who grew up, who were students in the 60s, we read a lot about Germany. But one of the most moving books I read about Germany was a novel by a gentleman called Günter Grass called The Tin Drum. And this was a novel which was a must-read for my generation of students, because it dealt with these issues of fascism, how they came about, how the population was cowed, and all that. So what I thought I should do is, there are so many missing elements in our own situation relative to what Dr. Schäfer said, that I decided I'm not going to read my speech. If you want it, you can get it from the foundation. What I'm going to do is to go straight to precisely the point that Theuns said was not addressed, which was the economy. This was a major shortcoming of our constitutional negotiation process, not addressing the issues of the economy. Now, from the side I was on, which was the ANC side, I know why we didn't address the issue of the economy. First, because the Communist Party had its own view about what the future economy should look like. So it didn't want that view to be contested. Secondly, the trade unions, especially the so-called workerists, had their own view of what the economy of South Africa should look like. Thirdly, the nationalists within the ANC, and Mandela was one of them, had their own view about what the future economy should look like. So to tell you the honest truth, on the ANC side, we were in no position to negotiate about the future of the economy of South Africa because we had no common position. I have a nagging suspicion we still don't have, certainly the ANC still doesn't have a common position on the economy of South Africa. So what does the ANC do in the absence of this common position? It sees the economy as something from which you eat. So what has happened to South Africa today? The ambassador talked about nation building. There is no nation building in South Africa. What we have is a feeding frenzy by the ruling party and its component parts. So what I will try and do is to show, because sometimes I'm a sociologist, so besides being a business person, so I will try, where's my friends? Am I pressing the wrong thing?
No, it should come up.
Is he there?
There.
I will try and show what, are we ready? I will try and show where we are with South Africa today. Where is our society today after 25 years of democracy? Because at the end of the day, at least in my training, it's the society that determines the constitution, not the other way around. So until we understand how our society functions, we are going to be faced with endless problems about the future. I know South Africans, many of us don't agree about the past. And the German ambassador has warned us about not having a consensus about the past. Now, I don't think we're going to heed his warning. So let's try and find a consensus about the future. Since we can't agree about the past, let's try and agree about the future. Because as Theuns has pointed out, if we don't move forward in terms of the future, we're heading back to conflict. And the irony about South Africa is that during the time of National Party rule, South Africa could not have a civil war because there was only one side which had arms. We could have massacres. We couldn't have a civil war. Today we can have a civil war because we're all armed. We all have access to arms. Our army, rickety though it is, has access to arms. It can split. The police can split. And so South Africa can have a civil war, and many people don't understand this message. Syria, why President Klerk mentioned this yesterday, that we had to avoid South Africa becoming like Syria. Well, South Africa can become like Syria. Why was it possible for Syria to happen? When the Assad regime was the one armed to the teeth. But what the Assad regime overlooked was that everybody had access to weapons. So the blacks had no access to weapons prior to 1994. Today they have. We have many blacks working for Denel. They make guns in Denel. We have many in the Air Force, pilots in the Air Force, with missiles, all that. So it is possible to have a civil war in South Africa, and if we carry on with the situation of our economy as it is today, we will end up there. Now, what is our social structure? I developed this to try and understand what really changed in the fundamentals of South Africa after the constitutional changes. And what really changed, one of the major changes in the society was the split between the business elite and the political elite. Prior to 1994, we had a unified business and political elite, which the issue of apartheid actually clouded what was really going on in South Africa. The National Party was a party of property owners, especially landowners. And as a party of property owners, they had a common interest with the mine owners. They had a common interest with the bank owners. And they still have a common interest with mine owners and with the bank owners. So we had a unified elite, if you wish, in South Africa prior to 1994. After 94, the elite changed. And this is an aspect of democracy that we in South Africa don't want to talk about, or we don't know, or we don't understand. The new political elite has no property. And that's one of the reasons why they see the state as the treasure trove from which they have to live off. If you look at during the National Party regime, the parliament met for, if I'm not mistaken, 4 or 5 months. And after that, you had to go back to your farm or to your business and so on. Today, our parliament meets forever. And these guys earn huge amounts of money. I heard somewhere that the starting salary of a backbencher is nearly R1 million. And you don't have to say anything. In fact, you can just sit there and sleep, and you will earn R1 million. It could never happen under the National Party because they had to make their property profitable. And Parliament had to facilitate that. It wasn't the source of their income. It was the source of the power to do all sorts of things, but it was not the source of income. Today, politics is a source of income for the political elite. So what do we have in South Africa? In South Africa, we have a business elite. Because we're a capitalist economy, obviously maximizing profits and protecting their assets is what its core objective is. We have a business elite with huge amount of strength in South Africa. They control the country's productive assets. 75% of our assets in South Africa, GDP, is in the private sector. And most importantly, they control the top skills in this country, your managers, your engineers, your accountants, your artisans, and so on. They are with the business elite. But they have some very, very, very fundamental weaknesses. Because of the separation between the business and the political elite, the business elite in South Africa has no control over the government. And this is an inheritance from the National Party government. It is dependent on state power and transport and land transport infrastructure. The consequence of lack of control or influence over the political elite is the vulnerability of the business elite in South Africa. Everybody talks about lack of business confidence in our economy and in our country. What they don't understand is that this is a very fundamental problem of South Africa, which accounts for the low investment that we have in our economy. In the South African economy, investment as a proportion of gross domestic product is almost always under 20%. In Asia, it's over 30% as a norm. In South Africa, it's under 20% as a norm. We had very briefly, at the height of the commodity boom, it went up a little bit above 20%, and immediately the growth rate jumped to 5 and 6%, but it has fallen back after that. So what we have, because of the lack of security of tenure for the business elite, we have massive vulnerability for the owners of capital. They have no security of their assets. We are seeing now the debate about expropriation of land without compensation. That is a threat to assets. It is showing the owners of capital that the people who control political power, with a stroke of a pen, they can take away their assets. Whatever assets, whether it's land, or it's buildings, or it's machinery. So the business elite in South Africa is hugely, hugely vulnerable to asset seizure. Their assets can expropriation of land without compensation is asset seizure. Secondly, even if you don't seize the asset, the tax system, with the tax system, you can take all the profits that you want. You may be a nominal owner of an asset, but the state can take your profits with its legislation. So this is the other vulnerability. Our tax system, far from our tax system supposed to help build our country, our tax system is a real threat to property in this country. Of course, they're exposed to corruption by the political elite. And the less said about that, because I think we know it. And then to the mismanagement of the economy. For example, the whole shuffling of finance ministers that we saw under Jacob Zuma, the whole issue about the independence of the Reserve Bank that we are seeing under the current regime, and so on and so forth. So what does all this add up to? It adds up to no or very little investment in the South African economy. And what is the consequence of not investing in the economy? This is the consequence of lack of investment. When you look at how our society is structured today, our working population, economically active population, and this was developed from the chart which I showed you earlier. I took that chart to the Statistician General in 2014 and said, I need some numbers about the elite, about how our society is structured. This is my understanding of it. So this is what he set up a team to work on this whole problem. This lack of investment in South Africa is what it produces. 49% of our economically active population is actually not in employment. Now, how long do you think a society with that is going to last for? Also because of lack of investment, even those who are in employment, the blue-collar workers, this is shrinking. This group is shrinking. So actually, when we looked at it in 2014, it was 49%. Today, it probably is over 50%, and that section of it has shrunk. But what do we see that has happened in South Africa is a growth, especially in those two sections, the elite and the middle class, and I will explain to you what the difference is between. And a big part of that growth is happening via redistribution through the tax system. So we're having an ironic situation in South Africa where the great majority of the population is living unemployed, living in poverty, but we are having a section of our population that is living the life of Riley, if I can put it that way. The other day, in October, the Minister of Finance in the midterm budget said that there are over 29,000 public servants and politicians who earn over R1 million each. Over 29,000. And what does this translate to? It translates to the transfer of wealth from the production part of our economy to the consumption part of the economy. And this is how this transfer happens. South African public sector government remuneration is the highest in the world. More than 14% of GDP of South Africa go into public service and politician salaries. This is the OECD rate, which is just above 10%. And these are the countries that are like South Africa: Thailand, Chile, Indonesia, Colombia. That's where our public service remuneration should be sitting. It's sitting at 14% of GDP instead of 6% of GDP. Now, if you're taking this extra 7% of GDP, more than 7%, let's say 8% of GDP from investment and give it to consumption by public servants, what do? You actually are promoting the purchase of imports. If you look at the top echelons of the public service in South Africa, they are amongst the biggest buyers of imports. All of them have a 4x4. Preferably the top German model. There's one called Cayenne, which is Ambassador, we are a good client. Apparently, we are among the best consumers or the highest consumers of whiskey and of top whiskies in this country, which come straight from Scotland. And that is what makes this possible. These 29,000, they don't consume South African products, they consume imports. So this is the situation that we are sitting with. So that trimming off of the surplus from the production sector of the economy goes to people in this group, and the consequence of this is the expanding poverty that we are sitting with in South Africa. So I ask myself, now what should we do? We have to find a way forward. And this is my last contribution. We may not agree on the past, but I hope we can agree on parts of the future. We have to, just to mention a point which I made yesterday when I was given an award by the foundation last night. The South African economy is structured as it was structured by the British at the end of the 19th century. We have to restructure our South African economy. And this is a message that's very difficult for people to understand. And I give an example of the United States economy. The United States economy, even after independence in 1776, was still structured as the British had structured it when the United States was a British colony. It was a slave-based economy producing cotton, which went to Lancashire to drive the British Industrial Revolution. That's what the United States economy, how it was structured. For 90 years, it was structured like this after independence. And the Americans realized that this is of no benefit to them eventually, and this created a huge conflict in the United States, which was the Civil War that eventually claimed 660,000 lives of Americans fighting amongst themselves as to whether they should retain this British inherited economy. We have the same British inherited economy in South Africa. If, and I think I'm correct, that we have been independent from Britain since 1910, we're now 110 years, and we're still running an economy that the British put in place to benefit themselves from our mineral resources. So our mineral-driven economy and the way in which the British built our mineral-driven economy is what is behind this massive surplus population that is not being which is not being employed, which is unemployable. It's the way the British designed our economy. So what I'm trying to do here is to say, let us redesign our economy, and hopefully, because all of us are threatened by this old economy that we have inherited, I hope we can agree. I hope we can agree that we need to change our electoral system. The electoral system of South Africa, and President de Klerk will correct me here, Theuns will correct me here, the PR system was a temporary system. And the PR system is absolutely lethal because the Member of Parliament has no independence and is not accountable, has no independent constituents. The consequence is that Parliament is a chamber for the party bosses to literally dictate to the rest of the country, and if the members of Parliament don't agree, they have no voice even to criticize or to object to that. So we have to deal with the issue of our electoral system. Secondly, of course, all these things are known to us. Education, healthcare, transport, electricity. There is huge problems, and as long as the surplus in our private sector is being consumed the way it is, we have no investment in South Africa. Everybody thinks that Transnet and Eskom are a problem because there is mismanagement. Well, there is mismanagement, but also there is no investment. There is no investment in infrastructure, in power generation infrastructure, in our schools, and so on, in hospitals, etc. The public service, as I have pointed out, the public service accounts for 35% of the government tax revenue, goes to salaries of the public service. This has to be halved to the 6% that countries like us pay for their public service. Our economic relations with our neighbors and our international partners are in a complete shambles. We collaborate in people like Robert Mugabe and Emerson Mnangagwa, destroying their economies to stay in power, and then their populations running to South Africa where we have to look after those populations. This has to stop. And Black economic empowerment. How can we ask a foreign investor who's coming to South Africa from Germany, arrives tomorrow, the first thing that he or she is faced with is, we'll take 26% of your equity, by the way, all for free, and we do nothing, and that's the price of you just coming to South Africa. So we cannot put the demands of Black economic empowerment on foreign investors. We have to remove those demands. Okay, the South African private sector was partly responsible, in fact, was mainly responsible for the creation, for the development of Black economic empowerment to protect itself. Well, then let them live with it. But on our way forward, we can't have this situation where there's huge transfer of wealth to rich politicians for doing nothing. We have to make our economy more investment driven rather than what it is today, which is consumption driven, and that consumption ironically is driven by credit. We have to move away from this huge credit consumption that is happening in the economy of South Africa. And lastly, we have to address the issue of South Africa's military posture. We're having riots in South Africa, the so-called xenophobic riots, because our military is incapable of doing anything. Literally, I was told the other day that the average age of a soldier in South Africa is 49 years old. The average age of a soldier in the United States Army is 19. Now, this 49-year-old grandfather, we are expecting them to guard the borders of South Africa, to defend the sovereignty of South Africa, to defend the welfare of the South African population. This is not going to happen. So, Mr. Chairman, I hope I have contributed a little bit to the way forward, and that there is a way forward, and that we must all work for the way forward. Yes, we have a huge past. South Africa is an old country. Many people forget. South Africa is as old, if not older, than the United States. So we have a long history. Let's leave the history to the historians.